What happens when a man forged in the fire of authentic struggle decides he's had enough of Hollywood's manufactured outrage? When Tyrus, the powerhouse who traded body slams for truth bombs, sets his sights on late-night television's self-appointed moral guardian, the result isn't just entertaining, it's explosive. This is the story of how one unscripted moment of raw honesty exposed the fragile foundation upon which Jimmy Kimmel's empire was built, and why millions of Americans stood up and cheered when someone finally said what they'd been thinking all along. The stage was set long before the cameras rolled. For years, Jimmy Kimmel had positioned himself as the conscience of America, the witty everyman who spoke truth to power from behind his desk in Hollywood. Night after night, he delivered monologues dripping with moral certainty, his teleprompter loaded with jokes written by people who'd never missed a meal or worried about making rent. The applause signs flashed on cue. The audience responded like trained seals, and Kimmel basked in the warm glow of his own righteousness, convinced that his nightly sermons were changing hearts and minds across the nation. But something had shifted in the cultural landscape. The American people were growing tired of being lectured by millionaires in makeup. They were exhausted by celebrities who lived in gated compounds, telling working families how to think, how to vote, how to live their lives. The disconnect between Hollywood and Main Street had become a chasm, and that chasm was about to swallow Jimmy Kimmel whole. Enter Tyrus. Born George Murdoch, he'd clawed his way up from nothing, fighting for every opportunity, every moment in the spotlight. He'd dominated in the wrestling ring, his massive frame and natural charisma making him impossible to ignore. But it was after he hung up his wrestling boots that Tyrus truly found his voice. As a commentator, co-host, and cultural observer, he became something Hollywood couldn't comprehend. Authentically himself. No handlers, no carefully crafted image, no desperate need for approval from the coastal elite. Just raw, unfiltered truth delivered with the confidence of a man who'd survived real battles and had the scars to prove it. The contrast between these two men couldn't have been more stark. Kimmel, who'd built his career on pranks and punchlines, now spent his evenings crying on camera about political outcomes he didn't like. Tyrus, who'd actually fought for a living, maintained the kind of composure that only comes from genuine strength. Kimmel hid behind writers and applause signs. Tyrus spoke off the cuff, his authenticity resonating with millions who'd grown weary of scripted sincerity. And then came the moment that would change everything. The moment when Tyrus decided he'd had enough of Kimmel's sanctimonious posturing and was going to do something about it. The setup was almost too perfect. There sat Jimmy Kimmel, comfortable in his studio kingdom, surrounded by the trappings of his success. The lights were positioned just right to minimize shadows and maximize his carefully cultivated relatability. His desk, that symbolic barrier between host and world, provided both literal and figurative protection. The audience, pre-selected and primed to laugh at the appropriate moments, filled the seats like extras in a play they didn't fully understand they were performing. Tonight's show would follow the familiar formula. A few jabs at political figures Kimmel deemed acceptable targets. Some self-deprecating humor that wasn't actually self-deprecating because it invited the audience to disagree. A celebrity interview or two with questions so softball they practically floated. And of course, the moral posturing that had become his signature. That peculiar blend of comedy and commentary that left viewers uncertain whether they were supposed to laugh or nod solemnly. But outside that studio, beyond the carefully controlled environment where Kimmel held court, a storm was brewing. Tyrus had been watching. He'd seen the tears, the lectures, the desperate attempts to remain relevant by becoming increasingly strident. He'd watched Kimmel transform from comedian to activist, to something that was neither funny nor effective. And like millions of Americans, Tyrus had reached his limit. The irony was delicious. Kimmel had spent years positioning himself as the brave truth-teller, the man willing to call out hypocrisy and expose phoniness. But he'd never looked in a mirror while doing it. He'd never considered that his own act might be the greatest performance of all, that his authenticity was as manufactured as anything coming out of a Hollywood studio lot. Those who knew Tyrus recognized the warning signs. There was a particular look he got, a narrowing of the eyes, a set to his jaw, that suggested something was about to happen. His friends and colleagues had seen it in the ring when an opponent went too far, crossed some invisible line that transformed competition into something more personal. And now, watching Kimmel's latest performance, that look appeared again. The atmosphere surrounding the late-night landscape had grown increasingly toxic. These weren't just shows anymore, they were political rallies disguised as entertainment. The hosts had become interchangeable, their monologues indistinguishable, their targets predictable to the point of tedium. They'd created an echo chamber so complete, so insulated from reality, that they genuinely seemed shocked when regular Americans stopped listening. Kimmel, in particular, had become emblematic of this disconnect. Here was a man who'd made millions making people laugh, who now seemed far more interested in making them think, or more accurately, making them think the way he thought. His comedy had been replaced by commentary, his jokes by judgments, and his audience, the ones still watching anyway, weren't tuning in for laughs anymore. They were there for validation, for the comfortable feeling of having their existing beliefs reinforced by someone on television. But there was another audience out there, a far larger one, that had stopped watching entirely. They'd grown tired of the lectures, exhausted by the constant moral hectoring, frustrated by the implicit assumption that they needed Hollywood celebrities to explain the world to them. These were people who worked real jobs, faced real challenges, lived real lives, far removed from the climate-controlled comfort of a television studio. Tyrus spoke for them, not because he'd appointed himself their representative, but because he was one of them. Despite his success, despite his platform, he'd never forgotten where he came from or what it took to get there. He understood struggle not as an abstract concept to be discussed in somber tones, but as a lived reality that shaped who you became. And so, with the stage set and the battle lines drawn, Tyrus prepared to do what no one else had been willing to do. Tell Jimmy Kimmel the truth about himself. Not the sanitized truth that publicists craft or the gentle truth that friends whisper. The real truth. The kind that stings because it's accurate, that resonates because it's been needed for so long, that changes everything because once it's spoken, it can't be unspoken. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't unfold on Kimmel's carefully controlled set. It happened where all modern battles are fought. In the court of public opinion, across social media platforms, through viral clips and passionate commentary. Tyrus didn't need to sit across from Kimmel to dismantle him. He simply needed to speak plainly about what everyone could already see. These guys, Tyrus said, his voice carrying that distinctive blend of authority and authenticity that had made him such a compelling presence, they had opportunities to reset. Kimmel could have come back and tried to be funny again, or bring guests again, or show any kind of change. But they're really going to ride this out to the last drop. The words landed like punches, concise, accurate, devastating. Because everyone knew he was right, Kimmel had been given multiple chances to remember what made him successful in the first place. After political defeats, after rating slides, after clear evidence that his audience was shrinking and his influence waning, he could have stepped back and reassessed. He could have returned to actual comedy, to the kind of entertainment that brings people together rather than driving them apart. But he hadn't. Instead, he doubled down, become more strident, more certain of his righteousness, more convinced that his political commentary was what people wanted despite all evidence to the contrary. He'd confused social media echo chambers with America, Twitter engagement with actual influence, the approval of his Hollywood peers with the respect of the nation. Tyrus continued, building momentum with each observation. What are they going to do when he's gone? The question hung in the air, uncomfortable in its implications. Because Kimmel and his fellow late-night hosts had built their entire personas around opposition, around resistance, around being against something rather than for anything. They'd become so consumed by their political obsessions that they'd forgotten how to be anything else. It's the loud voices that scare people from saying what they believe, Tyrus explained, cutting to the heart of the issue with surgical precision, and make you think twice about a joke or whatever, these things, and a lot of their points are valid, but a lot of them are also just repulsive. And I mean that in that they repel people. They go like, "Oh, you're no fun. I don't want to be around you." This was the truth Kimmel couldn't face, wouldn't face, was perhaps incapable of facing. His self-appointed role as moral guardian had made him insufferable. His constant political grandstanding had made him boring. His inability to laugh at himself or find humor beyond his narrow ideological framework had made him irrelevant to anyone outside his bubble. The internet erupted, not with shock, but with recognition. Millions of people who'd been thinking exactly what Tyrus was saying suddenly had someone willing to articulate it. The response wasn't coordinated or manufactured. It was organic, passionate, real, in a way that no amount of studio applause could replicate. Memes proliferated faster than Kimmel's writers could craft comebacks. Images of Tyrus, strong and confident, juxtaposed against clips of Kimmel crying on camera, side-by-side comparisons of authentic emotion versus performed emotion. Quotes from Tyrus's commentary shared and reshared millions of times, each iteration adding new layers of interpretation and agreement. The cultural divide became impossible to ignore. On one side stood Kimmel and his defenders, the people who still believed that late-night comedy should be a vehicle for political messaging, who saw nothing wrong with using entertainment as a platform for activism, who couldn't understand why anyone would object to being lectured while they were trying to relax. On the other side stood Tyrus and the millions who'd been waiting for someone to say enough. People who remembered when late-night television was actually entertaining, when hosts made you laugh without making you angry, when comedy brought people together instead of driving them apart. They weren't asking for political neutrality or false balance. They were asking for authenticity, for humor that came from observation rather than ideology, for entertainment that entertained. Tyrus pressed his advantage, each new comment adding fuel to a fire that was already raging out of control. "I expected to walk into work stepping over crying people," he said, his tone mixing bemusement with contempt. But it wasn't. Everybody went back to their lives. So the only way is if you film it or someone else films it. The observation cut deep because it exposed the fundamental delusion at the heart of Kimmel's entire operation. He genuinely believed his nightly broadcasts mattered, that his opinions carried weight beyond the walls of his studio, that people across America were hanging on his every word and being swayed by his arguments. But they weren't. Outside his bubble, life continued unchanged. People went to work, took care of their families, dealt with their actual problems, and gave exactly zero thought to whatever Jimmy Kimmel said on television the night before. "We never knew his political affiliation because he was there to make everyone laugh," Tyrus continued, referencing the earlier era of late-night television when entertainers understood their role. All the late-night shows were. The contrast was stark and damning. Previous generations of hosts had managed to be funny without being preachy, entertaining without being divisive, successful without sacrificing half their potential audience on the altar of political correctness. But Kimmel couldn't see it, or wouldn't see it. He was too invested in his new identity, too comfortable in his echo chamber, too surrounded by people who told him he was brave and important and making a difference. The possibility that he'd sacrificed his comedy career to become a less effective political pundit never seemed to occur to him. The confrontation escalated as Tyrus turned his attention to one of Kimmel's most egregious moments, a podcast appearance where the host and his celebrity friends had commiserated about political outcomes they didn't like. "It's like listening to two billionaires complaining about no one had change for their $100 bill at McDonald's," Tyrus said. And the metaphor perfectly captured the absurdity of watching wealthy celebrities present themselves as victims. "They're like three ex-lovers who just found out about each other," he continued, building on the theme with devastating accuracy. "And they're all getting together to talk about the man they all still love. They're just sizing each other up, trying to figure out which one of us has the best shot to get back with him." The analysis was brutal in its precision. Kimmel and his friends weren't offering meaningful commentary or insightful criticism. They were engaging in public therapy, processing their feelings on camera, and expecting America to care. The narcissism was breathtaking. The lack of self-awareness was complete, and Tyrus was holding up a mirror, forcing everyone to see what they'd been trying to ignore. "That's just why nobody cared," Tyrus concluded, and with those words, he destroyed whatever remained of Kimmel's pretensions to cultural relevance. Nobody cared about the podcast. Nobody cared about the celebrity commiseration. Nobody cared about wealthy entertainers complaining about political developments from the comfort of their mansions. The emperor had no clothes, and Tyrus was the only one honest enough to say it out loud. The response from Kimmel's camp was predictable and pathetic in equal measure. Rather than engage with the substance of Tyrus's criticism, rather than consider whether there might be some truth to the observations being made, they retreated to familiar territory. Tyrus was dismissed as bitter, as jealous, as ironically politically motivated. The very people who'd spent years injecting politics into entertainment were suddenly shocked and appalled that someone might have political disagreements with them. But the American people weren't buying it. They'd watched Tyrus rise from obscurity through talent and hard work. They'd seen him handle criticism with grace and humor. They'd observed his willingness to engage with people across the political spectrum, to find common ground, to treat others with respect even when disagreeing. And then they'd watched Kimmel cry on television, lecture his audience, and position himself as morally superior to half the country. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. Tyrus represented strength through authenticity. Kimmel represented weakness disguised as virtue. Tyrus spoke plainly and let his words stand on their own merit. Kimmel hid behind writers and production values and audience manipulation. Tyrus had earned his platform through decades of real work. Kimmel had inherited a time slot and confused being on television with being important. Social media became a battleground, but it was a battle with only one side fighting. Tyrus's supporters didn't need to defend him because his words defended themselves. They were true, self-evidently true. True in a way that required no spin or interpretation or careful framing. Meanwhile, Kimmel's defenders found themselves in the impossible position of trying to argue that a millionaire comedian crying about politics was actually brave and important and worthy of respect. The memes wrote themselves. Tyrus, strong and composed, next to Kimmel, tears streaming down his face. Tyrus, speaking extemporaneously with confidence, next to Kimmel, reading from a teleprompter with trembling voice. Tyrus, built by real struggle and authentic experience, next to Kimmel, shaped by Hollywood and sustained by self-delusion. You know, it's funny how this derangement's working, Tyrus observed, because it only seems to work if you have a camera in front of you. Another devastating truth, casually delivered, impossible to refute. Kimmel's emotional displays weren't genuine reactions to genuinely felt circumstances. They were performances, calculated to generate specific responses from specific audiences, and everyone could see it now that Tyrus had pointed it out. The cultural earthquake that followed wasn't about Tyrus versus Kimmel specifically. It was about what they represented. On one side stood authenticity, strength, humor that came from truth rather than ideology, entertainment that entertained, and respect for audiences as intelligent adults capable of forming their own opinions. On the other stood manufactured emotion, weakness disguised as sensitivity, humor that served political purposes, entertainment that lectured, and contempt for audiences who needed to be educated and enlightened by their betters in Hollywood. America chose a side, not everyone, not universally, but decisively. The ratings told the story. Tyrus's audience grew while Kimmel's shrank. The cultural influence shifted. The conversation changed, and Kimmel found himself increasingly isolated, surrounded only by the true believers who still thought crying on television was courageous and political monologues masquerading as comedy were meaningful contributions to public discourse. Should have been a reset, Tyrus said, referring to the opportunities Kimmel had been given to change course. I don't remember us doing an episode on coping skills. There was no line in the audience where I was like, "Thank you for coming. We're going to let's keep going." And I believe we made fun of the situation and ourselves. There it was, the fundamental difference laid bare. When faced with disappointment or setback, Tyrus and those like him responded with humor and resilience. They made fun of themselves, found the comedy in the situation, and moved forward. But Kimmel and his cohort responded with tears and tantrums, with emotional manipulation and moral lectures, with the kind of self-indulgent wallowing that repelled normal people. So I always tell people, try to be the bigger man, which is ironic, Tyrus added, his self-deprecating humor standing in sharp contrast to Kimmel's complete inability to laugh at himself. But in this case, because the poor sportsmanship is coming from TV, normally I would say you can have one lap and smell your flowers. But go ahead and take 4. The victory was complete, and Tyrus was gracious in it. He could afford to be. He hadn't just won an argument. He'd exposed a fundamental truth about the state of modern entertainment. The line between comedy and activism had been crossed so many times it no longer existed. Hosts like Kimmel had convinced themselves they were brave truth-tellers when they were really just performers who'd forgotten how to perform. The most remarkable aspect of the entire confrontation was how thoroughly Tyrus had dismantled Kimmel without ever raising his voice, without resorting to personal attacks, without sacrificing his dignity or composure. He'd simply told the truth, calmly and clearly, and let that truth do its work. Against such honesty, Kimmel had no defense. His usual tactics, appeals to emotion, moral grandstanding, hiding behind his writers, were useless. Comedy should sting with truth, not drown in comfort, became an informal rallying cry for those who'd grown tired of late night's descent into political programming. Tyrus had articulated what millions felt but couldn't express, that real comedy required courage, that authentic humor came from observation rather than ideology, that entertainment should challenge everyone rather than simply validate one side. Hollywood reacted with predictable horror. How dare someone question their moral authority? How dare someone suggest that crying on television wasn't brave? How dare someone imply that maybe, just maybe, wealthy celebrities lecturing working Americans about politics was condescending and counterproductive? The very idea that they might not be the heroes of this story was incomprehensible to them. But beyond the Hollywood bubble, in the real America that Kimmel had long since lost touch with, the response was different. Relief, vindication, appreciation. Finally, someone had said it. Finally, someone had called out the emperor's nakedness. Finally, someone had reminded the entertainment industry that their job was to entertain, not to educate or enlighten or transform society according to their preferred vision. Tyrus had become the voice of the unheard, not through calculation or ambition, but through authenticity. He represented millions of Americans who were tired of being talked down to, tired of being told they needed to be educated by celebrities, tired of having their entertainment hijacked by politics. And he did it without compromising himself, without playing Hollywood's games, without seeking approval from people whose approval meant nothing to him. The contrast with Kimmel was stark and devastating. One man had stayed true to himself and found success. The other had abandoned his identity in pursuit of relevance and found only isolation. One spoke with genuine confidence born from real experience. The other performed confidence while revealing increasing desperation. One had nothing to prove. The other could prove nothing. As the dust settled and the final battle lines were drawn, a clear winner emerged. Not because of any formal declaration or official judgment, but because of something more fundamental. The respect and admiration of millions of people who recognized authentic strength when they saw it. Tyrus had won not just the confrontation, but the larger cultural battle it represented. Kimmel, meanwhile, was left with his studio, his applause signs, his writers, and his echo chamber. All the trappings of success without any of the substance. All the appearance of influence without any of the reality. He could still cry on camera and receive praise from his bubble. He could still deliver political monologues and be celebrated by his peers. But outside that increasingly small circle, he'd become a punchline, a cautionary tale, an example of what happens when entertainers forget their purpose. The irony was almost too perfect. Kimmel had spent years positioning himself as the brave truth-teller, the man willing to speak uncomfortable truths to power. But when someone actually spoke uncomfortable truths to him, he had no response. He'd built his career on calling out others, but couldn't handle being called out himself. He demanded accountability from everyone except the one person staring back at him in the mirror. Tyrus, for his part, moved forward as he always had, focused on his work, authentic in his approach, unburdened by the need for Hollywood's approval. He'd said what needed to be said, exposed what needed to be exposed, and reminded America that strength doesn't require volume, that truth doesn't require performance, that authenticity will always triumph over artifice in the end. The cultural landscape had shifted. Late-night television would never be quite the same. The myth of the moral authority of comedians had been shattered. The emperor's clothes had been revealed as imaginary. And it had all happened because one man was willing to speak plainly about what everyone could already see. What started as a cultural commentary became a defining moment. A reminder that authenticity matters, that truth resonates, that millions of Americans are hungry for entertainment that doesn't lecture them, humor that doesn't divide them, and voices that don't condescend to them. Tyrus provided all of that and more, not through calculation but through simply being himself. Who was right? The question almost answers itself. But perhaps more importantly, who was real? Who spoke from genuine conviction rather than calculated positioning? Who treated their audience with respect rather than contempt? Who understood that comedy should bring people together rather than drive them apart? The answers were clear to anyone paying attention. And millions of Americans were paying attention, grateful that someone finally had the courage to say what they'd been thinking all along. This wasn't just Tyrus calling out Kimmel. This was a cultural moment, a turning point, a reminder that authenticity will always defeat artifice, that strength will always overcome manufactured emotion, and that truth, no matter how uncomfortable, will always find its audience. The legend had spoken. Hollywood had heard, and America had chosen its side.